Broadband Breakfast Live Online for Wednesday, March 17th, 2021. Happy St. Patrick's Day, everyone. I'm Drew Clark, editor and publisher of Broadband Breakfast. And before we get started with our program, I have to tell a small St. Patrick's Day story because in addition to being a broadband fan, I'm an attorney and I have a daughter who's 6 years old, and she's been talking about leprechaun tracks. So I'm thinking, okay, leprechauns, we can bind them in contracts, right? She's actually talking about leprechaun traps. And she set so many leprechaun traps that when I got up this morning on my way out of home to work, I ran into a bunch of spilled cereal. I go, who on earth got into this spilled cereal? I mean, this is just, one of these kids is really in trouble. And I open my refrigerator and I see some green milk. I go, oh, there's definitely been a leprechaun. I go back and check, oh, the cereals were Lucky Charms. So I definitely knew we had been attacked by a leprechaun. I'll have to get the report when I go home later today. Maybe I'll even find a pot of money. We'll have to check on our stimulus checks from Uncle Sam or Uncle Joe. In any case, thank you to all of you for being with us. We are now a year into Broadband Breakfast Live Online. We've been doing this for a year. Next week on March 24th, we're actually going to be having a bit of a reunion edition looking at the state of online education 1 year into the pandemic with some of the very people that participated in our event a year ago this month. And following that, on March 31st, we'll be talking with state broadband authorities about some of the broadband plans that they're involved with. We are very open to your ideas. My email is next to my name, drew@breakfast.media, or you can email us events@breakfast.media for future events. And please do share and let others know about Broadband Breakfast Live Online if you enjoy our conversations here every Wednesday at 12 noon Eastern Time. So to go to our topic of today, we are going to be speaking about broadband and broadband speeds. And the topic, perhaps a bit provocative for this one, was redefining broadband speed limit. Now, one of the great things of putting these events on is I hear from lots of you reach out to me and say, you've got it all wrong. That's the wrong framing for this topic. And that's a legitimate point. We can think of many measures of broadband speeds or quality, and probably speed in a strict technical sense may not be the right word because we're talking about the speed of light, right? It's more about how much content's buffering through. We do have a kind of a upstream and downstream speeds that we talk about, and we're going to talk about the way the Federal Communications Commission has defined that over the years. Originally, it was 200 kilobits in one or the other direction. It got changed to 4 megabits down and 1 megabit up in 2010, and then it went to 25 down and 3 up in 2015. And some, including authors of several bills, think that that should be changed. I also say that, we don't want to ignore things like latency and jitter, perhaps even subscriber ratio. These are things that may impact quality of broadband. And so I'm definitely going to be interested in all of our panelists' thoughts on whether speed is the right mark for defining and measuring broadband. I also want to just mention a bit of a modest proposal of my own. I think that for too long, and the pandemic has really emphasized this, for too long we've been relying on just one of those two speed measurements, namely the downstream speed. Oftentimes providers will highlight a 250 megabit or 1 gigabit downstream without really paying much attention to that upstream. And so I've always been a fan of multiplying the downstream times the upstream. So a 10 megabit down, 10 megabit up would get a speed score of 100 or 10 to the second power. A 25 by 25, or actually let's round that up, a 32 megabit by 32 megabit would be 1024 speed score, or roughly 10 to the third. 100 up, 100 down symmetrical connection would be a 10,000 speed score, or 10 to the fourth. And a gigabit up, gigabit down would be a 1 million speed score, or 10 to the sixth. So I think that obviously will give a real premium on symmetrical. I've kind of tipped my hand a little bit. I definitely want to hear all of our panelists' views on whether this is as important as I think it is to have that high upstream speed. But that's definitely something that I want us to talk about here. And the final thing I'll mention before we open it up to our panelists is the Accessible, Affordable Internet for All Act that has been introduced. This is House Majority Whip Jim Clyburn's bill. Actually puts in a couple of tiers. It would authorize funding and it define funding to the areas that are unserved, which is defined as below 25 down, 25 up megabits, and then areas with low tier would be between 25 down and 25 up and 100 meg down and up, and then the rest, the served areas are 100 down, 100 up. So that's from legislation. It hasn't yet passed, but it's out there. It's a marker, and so it's kind of moving in this direction of putting a higher premium on symmetrical service. And so again, we want to hear that from our panelists as we open it up to them. So with that, and without further ado, let me go ahead and introduce each of our three panelists for today's discussion. We are going to hear first from Tyler Cooper. Tyler's the editor-in-chief of Broadband Now. Broadband Now has been doing lots of research, and we've been featuring these. We have some videos of interviews with Tyler and his staff talking about the research that they've done. We'll look forward to hearing a little bit more about some of these, Tyler. Following Tyler will be Jonathan Chambers. Jonathan is partner at Connexxon LLC, and he was previously the chief of the Office of Strategic Planning and Policy Analysis at the FCC, where he certainly ruffled a lot of feathers, and we'll hear from him today, and hopefully he'll ruffle some more feathers. Finally, we're going to hear from Christina Mason. Christina is currently the Vice President of Government Affairs at the Wireless Internet Service Providers Association, and she's worked extensively on the Hill in focusing on the broadband issues of concern to WISPA members who are very vocal group of people and very active in providing service to large parts of rural America. So with that, let's go ahead and open up to you, Tyler. Let's hear some of your thoughts on the definition of broadband.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you again for having me and all of our panelists. This is awesome. Great to be here. Looking forward to hearing from Jonathan and Christina. This is awesome. This is always a great opportunity to learn. So just to give a quick kind of understanding. So Broadband Now Research, we're all about sort of doing everything we can to better sort of quantify and define the digital divide from all of its perspectives. So that, for a long time for us, that was pretty squarely focused on access. We built a data set that essentially was rivaling the FCC's, looking at, where plans were and weren't available. But over the years, we've also sort of pivoted to starting to look more into performance of those networks as well, especially over the past year. As the pandemic has unfurled, we spent about 7 weeks around this time last year looking at internet performance across the top 200 most populous US cities, just in an effort to better understand kind of how networks were faring and really just what was happening sort of at scale. I think there was a ton of conversation locally about, whether internet was holding up or, what was happening in many areas, but we wanted to take a wide look and say, are internet networks across the US up to the task? And what we found during that time period was that the answer was largely yes. Networks did not collapse as some were fearing, during that time. We definitely observed isolated cases of both upload and download speeds being reduced, median upload and download speeds, I should say, being reduced by as much as 40% in some areas. So there were certainly areas that felt this sudden sort of surge of remote working and learning around this time last year. But for the most part, networks held up. And I think that one of the things we were interested in looking at, just as a result of sort of that initial study was, is there sort of a need for us to increase the bottom floor here? Because, while we say that networks held up, a lot of times we were seeing major cities trending at an average of like, say, 5.7 to 6 megabits per second upload speeds. that would teeter and kind of fall out of range week to week. It might go down to 3 megabits per second, again, edging up against the minimum there. And so we started to wonder, is this going to be adequate in the future? And obviously, it's my personal belief that it won't be. I think that, the bandwidth requirements for our applications are showing no signs of slowing. Like we may get to a point at some point, down the road where bandwidth efficiency reaches a point where it does level off. But at the moment, it seems as though that's not the case. And so one of the things that we also look at is, what do consumers understand this? And is that being reflected in their demand? Is this something that people are becoming aware of as the pandemic continues to unfold and as people are more aware of their internet connection than ever before? And one of the things that we do to kind of better understand consumer sentiment is we release every year a US shopping study that focuses on new home services purchased over the prior year. We actually have our 2021 release going out tomorrow morning, actually, so that's good timing. But it had something pretty interesting that I thought was worth sharing, which is that in 2019, there were out of every American that we surveyed, there were 41% of survey results that showed that consumers who purchased new internet purchased it at 25 to 100 megabits per second download speeds. If you look at 2020, so over the past year, that same group shrunk considerably to 26% of Americans that purchased a plan for 25 to 100 megabits per second download. If you look at those same 2 years, 9% in 2019 purchased a plan between 300 and 1,000 megabits per second, so only 9%. In 2020, that same number rose to 29%, so a 20% increase. So this demand is being shown in consumer sentiment. We're seeing that not only are people more aware of the speeds that they're getting, they're also, craving a higher speed. And obviously this is just looking at download. As Drew said, so much of the conversation is centered around download. Whenever we're polling consumers, it's pretty difficult there's still an awareness barrier, I think, between download and upload. It's still lumped in a lot of cases and people aren't really aware of the differences. But I think that, this shows that, again, there may also be a sort of a disconnect in what consumers expect out of their internet connection because of that. They expect it to be faster. So I think that it's my view that I believe that, connections should push to be closer, at least in upload and download speeds. Obviously we're hearing a lot of talk about potentially a symmetrical standard. And I think that the consumer sentiment reflects that. Oh, Drew, I
muted myself. Awesome. Thank you for that great introduction, laying out, and it's great to hear these real life statistics of the consumer preference for higher and higher speeds. So great to have that context. Let's go ahead and open it to you, Jonathan. Would you be willing to tell us a little bit about Connexxon and your approach to this topic, plus the history you bring as you've looked at this at the FCC?
Yeah, thanks, Drew. It's good to be with you again. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks for the polite characterization of my personality. I think ruffling feathers is the nicest way anybody's called me a jackass, but it's I think to be true to form, let me start out by saying I think you're asking the wrong question, and I'll touch on that as the hour goes through. To tell you a little bit about what Connexxon does, what my business partner and I do, and the hundreds of people who work for us do. I just returned this morning from Mississippi, and if you are interested in the future of broadband, if you're interested in seeing the future of broadband, you should go to Mississippi. Mississippi is in the midst of a transformation in the provision of telecommunications and internet access services, which has a transformation which is the first of its type in 100 years, but which I think will last now for the next several decades, the next 100 years. And it looks like this. 2 years ago, the legislature in Mississippi passed a law allowing rural electric cooperatives, or electric power associations as they're called in Mississippi, to enter the internet access business. Prior to that, there'd been a state Supreme Court case on point that had generally prohibited electric cooperatives from entering into any other line of business than electricity. So the law was passed in January of 2019, which means that the electric co-ops in Mississippi had missed the Connect America Fund auction, had not been permitted to participate in that auction. And nearly there are 25 electric power associations in Mississippi, and nearly everyone examined the business case of getting into the business. And in the past 2 years, since permitted to get into the business, the vast majority, 18, 19, maybe it's 20 by now, of the electric power associations have started the process of constructing networks, participated in the RDOF auction, that has applied for and received grants from the CARES Act, where the Mississippi legislature last year provided a matching, and anybody who's a state sort of broadband, part of a state broadband agency, I would encourage you to look to the way Mississippi did this with their CARES Act money last year, because it worked extraordinarily well. They provided for matching funds for anyone that would build fiber networks into unserved areas and could do so within the time allotted under the CARES Act, which at the time meant had to be done by the end of 2020. So in the course of just a few months, we at the time, working with 7 electric co-ops, built 2,000 miles of fiber networks in the most unserved parts of the state, passing 20,000 homes or so. In some cases, we started projects in September and started connecting members of the co-ops in October. The CARES Act money became a spur to the later participation by most of the co-ops in the state in the RDOF auction. Most of the co-ops in the state won funds in the RDOF auction and are building networks to all of their networks, to all of their members, fiber to the home networks to all of their members. The Mississippi legislature had passed in the law that if a co-op were to get into the business, they needed to have a plan to build and offer service to 100% of their membership, which wasn't really a hard requirement for the co-ops, because that's what they've been doing for the past 85 years, 86 years now in parts of Mississippi. The first electric co-ops in the nation were in Mississippi. So it shouldn't surprise those who know the history to know that the first place really in the country where most of the state will be served with broadband will be Mississippi. So to give you one, this to me is a sort of startling realization. 2 years ago, the largest recipient of public funds in the state of Mississippi was AT&T. They had received hundreds of millions of dollars in the last 5 years to deliver 10 megabits per second down, 1 megabit per second up service. Today, the largest recipients of public funding are the electric co-ops in Mississippi. The largest recipients meaning as they build their networks, they will become the largest providers of broadband service in Mississippi, period, in rural Mississippi, certainly, displacing AT&T, which is Old Bell South, which is Old Bell, Mississippi, part of the Old Bell system, which has been around for 100 years. Over the course of just 2 years, the transformation from rural service of internet access has changed and will, over the next 5 years, change completely, so that rural service in Mississippi will have changed from the provision of service by AT&T to the provision of service by a group of electric co-ops that were formed in 1936, 1937. That's a remarkable transformation. And it's one that we're proud to be part of, not just in Mississippi, but in across the country. It is a community-led effort, community-owned assets, community-operated assets to provide, and now I'll finally make my point about your definition of broadband as to why I think you're asking the wrong question. The way to look at broadband is what do people want? What do people subscribe to? Not what does an office in northeastern Washington, D.C., or me sitting inside the Beltway in Maryland, or any of us think broadband is. The right question is, what does the public subscribe to? That's what the Communications Act asks in Section 254. What does the public subscribe to? That's how you define broadband.
Great. Well, thank you. And that'll be food for thought for our next discussion participant and for what we talk about afterwards. Christina, let's go ahead and turn it to you to tell us a little bit about how WISPA measures broadband performance and what you think of the definitions for broadband.
I think everybody may faint when I say I agree with Mr. Chambers on one point he made. I actually do. I think what the public is using and what the public needs 100% should inform how we define broadband. So everybody can now, rest peacefully for the rest of their lives, because there is a point of commonality on this call where we kind of diverge. I think the problem that's happening in Washington, D.C. is that we are conflating a lot of different problems and trying to solve it with one silver bullet solution that we pass this forevermore. We're never going to have to do subsidies. We're going to connect America once and for all. Everyone's going to have gigabit by gigabit symmetrical, and everyone's happy. That's this broadband utopia. The challenge is that, especially the people on this call, you guys are by far the experts in the room, not me at all. I do not profess to be an expert, but just by observation, just by a common consumer in suburban DC, I can see that there are issues in connecting truly unserved America. I am not unserved America. I have access to broadband. I have access to competitive broadband plans. I can choose whichever ISP that fits my budget, fits my speed requirements. I'm privileged enough to have that access, absolutely. When we're talking about the truly unserved communities, they have a different need. They have a different scenario. They have a different landscape. They often don't have competition because it's very hard to get to these areas. Let's be real. They're unserved for a reason. They're ultra remote. They live on a bog. They live on top of a mountain in West Virginia. Whatever the scenario may be, that's where they are. And they are not getting the connectivity that 100% we will argue everyone needs. When we're talking about, is 25.3 adequate? I think there should be a conversation there. I think WISPA 100% is at the table for the conversation about where should baseline be. Absolutely. The challenge is when you pick one solution, saying, this is it. This is the solution for everyone. What works in Mississippi, what works in South Carolina, 100% will work in Alaska, in Hawaii, in West Virginia, in Maine, in Kansas, in Nebraska. It works everywhere. Electric co-ops are the solution. Fiber is the solution for everyone. That's where we're starting to lay the traps, where we convince ourselves this utopia can be had by simply empowering electric co-ops to lay fiber everywhere. The challenge is that there are a lot of communities that won't be reached by that fiber for whatever reason. Maybe their local electric co-op has absolutely no interest in delivering broadband to their community. They're digging in on clean energy, making sure that they have a smart grid and a smart network for their cities and towns and rural communities. 100% their prerogative. But what does that mean then if you start spelling out policies that are targeting, hey, electric co-ops, here's $100 billion for you guys to do what you need to do, and the electric co-op says no thanks? Who then is the competition? Who then is the alternative in these states to deliver high quality, high speed internet. I'm not saying either fixed wireless is the answer, one size fits all to everyone. Sometimes it works, and when it works fantastically well. We get up to gigabit download many times in many places. The challenge is we're not going to argue fixed wireless works everywhere. We would never, anyone with a BA from a local community college couldn't argue that. Never mind engineers and people who do this all day, every day. What we need is kind of tech neutrality in the approach. If we're talking, again, are we talking about unserved communities, or are we talking about leveling up the already served? Inserting competition and choice into, monopoly markets by incumbent broadband or, telecom providers. Those are two different conversations. So if we're talking about the unserved, there should be a tech neutral approach that allows fixed wireless, cable, fiber, electric co-ops, legacy telecom, telcos, fixed wireless providers, satellite providers at the table to make sure that community can get access first. We're talking about the guys with 5 megs, 10.1, those folks are still here. I was just on a phone 2 days ago with a member in Southern Florida. He's, actually first time deploying in this area. He is a startup WISP in Southern Florida. He's delivering minimum 50 by 5 to this area that only has DSL and some satellite connectivity. These guys have nothing. And he's coming in with minimum speeds of 50 by 5. And of course, if they so choose to pay for more, there's 100 by 10 and up, so on. He has a full speed tier availability. You're telling me this guy shouldn't be eligible to serve this community because he's not delivering symmetrical speeds today? Okay, fine. Then if not him, who's going to do it? And I know Jonathan's going to, electric co-ops, we got him. Jonathan, he's booking his flight to South Florida now, and I understand that. He has an interest in doing that. But what I'm saying is, why don't we keep everyone at the table to ensure that today there's meaningful connectivity? And then when we're looking 100 years down the line, there's competition for consumers that allow for affordable packages. I did some digging on Mississippi. The median package range is about $150 a month. That's not cheap. Now, of course, we're probably advocating for, some kind of emergency broadband benefit or other things that make these packages more affordable. But why? Why should a fully government subsidized network need affordability credits to make consumers be able to afford what the government just paid them to deploy? I think what we're missing here is the crux of what is the role of government in deploying broadband? Is it to connect unserved communities, the truly unserved, where we all agree, whether you're deploying fiber, fixed wireless, cable, whatever, it doesn't make financial or economic sense due to density, population density characteristics of the area. They're sitting on a shale rock bed, they're in a frozen tundra, they're Hawaii. Whatever the reason is that it's really hard to deploy there, yeah, maybe the government should come in and subsidize a minimum speed standard, which again, we're open to discussing. I think Tyler made very good points about maybe there should be some evolutionary metrics for baseline speeds. Maybe it should evolve with technology. Why do we continue to lock into one speed for one time? But when we're talking about, making sure unserved communities are connected, we have to remember that they don't have anything, or they have below 25, sorry. So that getting these folks online are important.
So let me try to get some clarifying questions here. I've thought of 3 questions, 2 are yes, no, that I want all 3 of you to address, just so we can kind of get out on the table where we are on some of these subjects. Question 1, Should the FCC's current definition of broadband as 25 megabits per second down, 3 megabits up be changed? Yes or no? Should it be changed? Yes or no? 2, if it is changed, should the definition include a symmetrical definition, whether it's 25/25 or 100/100 or 1 gig, 1 gig, yes or no? And then third, if you think these are inadequate, if you want to reject my premise about speeds, great. Tell me what elements should be included in that definition. Or if you want to argue there's no need for a definition, FCC should get out of the business, scratch up all those rules it has right now. Let's hear that too. So let's do Tyler, Jonathan, Christina. These 3 questions, please. Tyler, you're on mute, Tyler.
Every time. Yeah, I'll answer them simply. So yes, to the first question, I do think that it's time for that definition to change. Changed in 2010 and changed in 2015. It's 2021. Technology is changing. I think the definition should change as well. As far as what it should change to, broadband now, last year we advocated for 100/25 as a measure of improvement. There's been a lot of talk about 100/100. I think that's a wonderful goal. I think that, one of the things that Christina brought up is really interesting, which is that, and as you brought up too, Drew, there's this talk of sort of using a multi-leveled approach to understanding broadband in various capacities. Like, okay, is 100/100 a standard for a well-serviced community? Whereas if there's an area that doesn't have any service, does a asymmetric, standard make sense to get people online? I think this is, it's difficult to paint with a broad brush here because, I think it is important to balance the conversation around getting people connected today, which is essential, but also serving them well in the long run, making sure that if we're spending federal funding to get people connected today, we want to make sure that that connection appreciates over time and is something that will be valuable to not only them, but their kids, future community members. We need to keep all this in mind when we're talking about how we roll out networks. So that's my opinion.
Yeah. So Jonathan, your take.
So to answer your first question, 25/3 is not the FCC definition. It is a definition the FCC uses. The FCC currently defines broadband in various of its programs as 4.1, 10.1, 25/3, 25/5, 120 gigabit, 500, and 50/10. It has all of those definitions, and then there are some other definitions that it uses and states uses, and as you point out, there's definitions in federal legislation, both passed and proposed. So there isn't a yes, no, should it be changed? There is no particular definition. It's not 25/3 today. Now, my point is, you have to define what it is you're using the definition for. If you're using it for unserved, which is how the FCC used 25/3 in the last auction, that's a definition. They also use a definition as to what you have to provide to be considered broadband service. So those are other sets of definitions. So I think there's the sort of your first, really the first question, what is it? What should it be? It's what's the use of the definition? If the use of the definition is to define unserved areas for the purpose of federal funding, that's really the use of 25/3 today. What is considered unserved so that federal funding might be spent in those areas? I would say again, according to the Communications Act, that's the wrong measuring stick. The way to look at where areas should be funded should be by using Section 254, areas that are high-cost rural and low-income consumers. There's also another section that has to do with funding educational institutions. But when you're talking about the universal service part, the core of universal service, it is for serving high-cost rural areas and low-income consumers. So there, I'd say, okay, so the question is for that category that is statutorily required, the FCC's job, how should you define telecommunications and information services or advanced information services, I would say again, look at the other part of the statute, same section of the act, to decide what it should be, what we should be funding to get those communities, what type of service those communities should get as far as the funding mechanism. And there I just, again, same paragraph, same section, section 254. The service for those communities should be, according to the statute, reasonably comparable to service in urban areas at reasonably comparable rates. If I could change one word, same word, but in two places in the statute, from the time that we were talking about that in the early 1990s to today, I would drop the word reasonably for this reason. Because those, over the course of the last 25 years since those words were enacted, people who argue that things should be reasonably comparable in rural areas or reasonably comparable for low-income consumers typically lean heavily on the word reasonably. That is to say, they mean not comparable. I would drop the word reasonably. I don't think the whole Communications Act needs to be rewritten. I don't think it needs to be rewritten at all. I think there needs to be a couple of changes. I would drop the word reasonably, and then I would use that as the benchmark. The FCC could determine what it is that is available in urban areas. I would also make it urban and suburban, but what is available? That should be the service that is available, comparable service available in rural high-cost areas and to low-income consumers. And I would make it affordable by defining what affordable is. And then whatever subsidy flows, I would make it, back to my earlier point, I would make the subsidy for providing service to high-cost rural areas and low-income consumers. It would be based on that which the majority of people subscribe to today. And I would make it available to any carrier that is providing that service in a rural high-cost area or to a low-income consumer. So I do believe, look, I don't believe in technological neutrality because I think that term is often used to display technological ignorance. But I do think anyone that is capable of providing the service without defining whether it's, Starlink or fixed wireless or DSL or a HFC system or fiber to the home, anything that is capable of delivering the service, which is defined as comparable to the service that is available in urban areas, then that provider of service should be eligible for the subsidy to the extent we're talking about where the funding goes, which is really that's where it comes down to as defining broadband. It's the only reason anybody even attempts to define broadband. All due respect to Tyler, they do a great job at letting people know what's available and where. But for purposes of government activity, you define broadband so you can determine where funding should be and what that funding goes for.
Okay, good benchmark there. Christina, I want to make sure to ask the same question about the current definition, which now has been poked full of holes, but be that as it may, is the current definition, does it need to be changed, yes or no? Is symmetrical something that should exist in that definition, yes or no? And if not, or whatever the case, what is your preferred definition?
So if I ever need an attorney, I am hiring Mr. Chambers. He is probably the best attorney I've met in a long time. And I'm around attorneys my entire career. That was a fantastic non-answer. So I'm going to follow his lead. I think that I wholly agree with him that there is no clear answer on any of those questions, because what we're again doing is mixing the majority of America lives in urban and suburban areas, right? So if we're talking about what the majority of America wants, what the majority of America subscribes to, the majority of America has access to a bevy of solutions, including cable, fiber, fixed, whatever they want. The challenge is are we talking about the unserved communities, which I think Tyler did a very good job of parsing out that there are two kind of segmented arguments here. If we're talking about truly unserved, does it make sense for us to have a baseline that reflects what urban America is getting and receiving Obviously, there are economic and population density characteristics. It makes sense for telecom companies to deploy in urban America and make a buck. That's why they have service. Let's be real. That's why it's happening. But when we're talking about providers who are staking out these unserved areas, largely WISPs, where they are independently owned, small private networks that by and large don't take subsidy to deploy, they have a different calculation to make when it comes to what speeds they can, should, and will deliver. What are their customers buying? You can deploy gigabit by gigabit service, but if no one's going to buy it because I know I'm not answering how
Christina,
you want me to answer.
Do you think it's a definition? Yeah. All right, go ahead,
for a second. So I'm not giving a non-answer. The question about what the FCC defines has consequence. The FCC only defines broadband for the purpose of spending the public's money. That's why they defined what broadband is. If you ask the question, what should the definition of broadband be? You should look at the statute. The statute tells you what the definition of broadband should be. The statute tells you that the definition of broadband for unserved areas, meaning high cost areas typically, should be that which is available in urban areas. That's what the statute says. What does that mean in practical terms? Yeah, typically that means in most places of the country, that's cable. In a lot of growing places, it's cable and fiber. It's all sorts of other services. But that's what the statute says. It's not a non-answer. I'm just saying follow the damn statute.
So, Christina, just giving you a chance to address, is the 25.3 a good simplification or a bad simplification for the purpose that we've been honing in on, defining where federal money is going to go to subsidize unserved or high cost areas?
It depends, period.
On what?
On the local community that is being served. So it depends on what you're talking about. 25.3 makes sense for a lot of communities. It really does, especially when they're only getting 5 down or 10. Yes, 25.3 makes sense. If you're talking about a community who has, I think we can have a conversation on speeds. Absolutely. I think we can have a conversation. I don't want to be the slumlord of slow speeds here. We're not trying to advocate that people who should have slower speeds. We're not the slow skis, right? Fixed wireless is completely capable of doing 25, 50, 100 megs down. That's fine. It's when you're talking about symmetry. I think that's where we're kind of not meeting eye to eye. We can have a conversation on baseline. I think Jonathan, actually, not facetiously, I think he has a compelling argument. I think we should read into what's reasonably comparable. What does that mean? Does that mean can kids go to school? Can workers get online and telecommute? Can you stream a Netflix program? Yes, you can do that with 25.3. That's ample. If you're talking about reasonably comparable, absolutely. If we want to talk about symmetrical, though, that's why, I know that Jonathan does not ascribe to tech neutrality. That is an ignorant term. So whatever term you would like to say of adding competition and choice to consumers, not building government monopolies that will take us back 50 years and not ahead 100, that's the conversation we have to have. Symmetry means fiber. We know that. We all know that. Is that truly the solution for America right now?
Let me ask Tyler to weigh into this additional question. So kind of maybe sidestepping tech neutrality as a term. You have looked at different technology types: fiber, coax, fixed wireless, mobile, satellite. Okay. So what are you seeing in terms of the different technology types and how they really perform in the real world? At least according to customers' satisfaction and measurements about that. Could you just talk to this point about the different technologies and whether they are in the real world capable of delivering those higher speeds, those symmetric speeds that some of us in this conversation have been talking about?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'm not going to say anything that anyone listening to this doesn't already know. There are differences in capabilities between a fiber network and a DSL network, for instance. You're not going to get 1,000 over 1,000 on a DSL network, and you will on a fiber network. But I think, this conversation so often, and we've had some excellent comments so far, but this conversation is often hyper-focused on, what we're advertising, or, what service providers are saying that they're going to offer. And again, even in this conversation, we found ourselves talking so much about download speed, when we started off by saying the upload's really important, right? But, I think that, and I've been accused of being quite a futurist on this point, but I think that it's really, and I'm kind of going back on what I said again, but it's really important that we look at how networks are evolving and how consumer behavior is evolving. We're talking a lot about, let's define broadband by what the public subscribes to. Well, what the public subscribes to today may not be reflective of what they subscribe to in 5 years, as our data shows, year over year, looking at how consumer trends change and how they're, even just over the past year, how their awareness of their own connection has improved and how they've become more interested and invested in having better broadband and understanding that it's no longer just a luxury. It's something that they're all of a sudden relying on far more in the home. So yeah, I think that there is consequence to this definition. I think that, I'm learning a lot perspective wise, just listening to the two other panelists talk about how they view this sort of catch-all definition. We spend a lot of time talking about what that should be for federal funding purposes. It's clear that it's a complicated question, but yeah, I think from a technological standpoint, we should be doing everything in our power, whether that's a federal definition or some other incentive, to put in place technologies that are going to serve us well in the future. And I personally don't believe that that's something like a legacy connection like DSL.
Now, when you include the comments that we're getting in this chat, there's kind of three big picture discussions going on. One is reasonable or reasonably competitive, or just reasonable comparable, or just comparable, right? That's what Jonathan's pushed, and there's obviously some logic to that. There's the practical numbers, like what are the numbers, 25.3 or 25.25 or 100 that people are going to talk about, and that does get confusing, I admit, and it's putting a lot of emphasis on the up and the down. I want to pull back in some of those things I raised at the start of this conversation: jitter, latency, subscriber ratios, capacity, because those are very important quality metrics that shouldn't be overlooked. And so my question, I'm going to start with Jonathan on this one, is what is your view from the inside of the FCC of putting some other, again, you've made a good case that it shouldn't be focused on the speeds, it should be the reasonable comparable. But if you are going to put in some more technical measures like latency, let's just say, what would you do? How would you do this from your perspective, former perspective of the office of go ahead.
So yeah, my perspective then, my perspective the same. The FCC doesn't just focus on speed. I don't mean to sound so pedantic about it, but that isn't the FCC's definition. The FCC takes into consideration four characteristics. Speed is one of them. And as I mentioned, the FCC has multiple definitions of speed they use for different purposes. They also take into account capacity. When they place a requirement on a recipient of funds, they require that you offer a minimum capacity level. In the last auction, every single winner in the RDOF auction will have to have a capacity of at least 2 terabytes a month of service. I saw something the other day where AT&T thinks that already the average consumer on their fiber networks is using over 1 terabyte of service. So I think if you even think of 2 terabytes, that seems awfully pedestrian if you look at the future, partly to Tyler's point. They also, latency is one of the issues. Less than 100 milliseconds is considered low latency. At times they've used other definitions, less than 30 milliseconds. And the fourth is affordability. So it doesn't make any difference. Because it was mentioned about cost in Mississippi, every co-op we work for in the state of Mississippi offers 100 megabit symmetrical service, unlimited capacity, low latency, all that, for $49.95. And gigabit service symmetrical for $79.95. We believe that's affordable, but these are not-for-profit institutions that are running these operations, so they have to at least break even. Should you take into account other things? Of course you should. Is jitter important? Sure, all of these things are important. My kid won't play, he he won't play, Madden or Fortnite if the ping is more than 10. So all of these are taken into account, but they're taken into account by consumers. And it's only good to a consumer if it's available. So what I'm really saying is, with respect to federal funding, because we are at a point in time where the federal government is talking about spending over $100 billion. So my one piece of advice to my former colleagues in Capitol Hill, my former colleagues at the FCC, if you're going to spend over $100 billion, don't cheat the public. Don't aim low. Invest in infrastructure. That's the infrastructure funding. Invest in infrastructure that is long-term infrastructure, in assets that will last 30 years and longer. But don't do it only as part of an infrastructure bill. In order to maintain the competitive landscape, because what has happened over the decades, what happens time and time again, is there are government conferred monopolies, and then there are government protected monopolies. In the usual way government protects monopolies is by funding. So in order to protect even those recipients, even us as a recipient of RDOF, to protect the geographic area, to make sure that there will be competition, I believe there ought to be also a competitive based subsidy, which goes to the provider of service, to a consumer that subscribes to some definition of broadband. So that way you invest in infrastructure, but you also have available, so that you don't lock up geographic areas for the next 10 years or longer to a single provider. Make it available to providers of service, any provider of service, SpaceX, fixed wireless, copper, if copper ever gets there, cable, fiber, any transmission medium. My point about technological neutrality is, let's not get all bent over ourselves on technological neutrality. Make funding available based on consumer choice, because consumer choice is the ultimate arbiter as to what is what. What is broadband? What do people want? What do people need? I recognize that if you're making funding available in an area on consumer choice where there's no choice, it's a hollow promise. That's why you need both some infrastructure funding and this undergirding of competitive subscriber-based subsidies in rural high-cost areas and for low-income consumers, just like the statute says.
Christina, there's been a lot of talk since the RDOF Phase 1 auction. Many awards went to, obviously, a lot of new entrants, rural co-ops, also fixed wireless providers, and some have said, well, these fixed wireless providers have won on gigabit promises, and the criticism goes, I'm not saying this, the criticism goes that they're not going to be able to meet those thresholds. What's your response to that about the RDOF funding and the promises made? And how do you think that bears on this discussion we're all having here about the right standard to use for broadband funding going forward?
Absolutely, and I will 100% answer this, but I do want to also reserve some time to address what Mr. Chambers brought up about the rest of the infrastructure package. We wholly agree. So I want to reserve time to talk about, it's not just about speeds. It's not just about technology. There is an infrastructure conversation here too, including if folks get funds, should there be open access to this fiber? Should there be access to the infrastructure that whatever this provider is laying this fiber, maybe to ensure there is competition, that there should be open access to their infrastructure because there's this $100 billion going out the door. But I digress. To answer your question on RDOF, we 100% believe that FCC is fully capable through the long form process to determine what technologies are capable to deliver and deploy whatever they promise. It's up to the FCC, it's up to the smart people and former colleagues of Mr. Chambers. I 100% have full faith that they will be able to do their job and do it well. I know there's some allusions to, one of the biggest providers happens to be a fixed wireless provider. They're deploying fiber. So it's whether can fiber hit gigabit? That's like, I'm hearing that's a yes, that's a settled question. A lot of WISP are deploying fiber. A lot of WISP are deploying hybrid networks. And depending on where they are and where their service, the propagation characteristics of whatever spectrum they're deploying, some can do gigabit. I don't have their long form. I don't know the information they're telling the FCC. I don't know their plans. I don't know what financial background they have. It's not for me or any outside, competitor to determine who's eligible to compete for these funds. I think it's wholly within the jurisdiction of FCC, and they'll do an excellent job.
So we have one question here I want to ask. There's a lot of chatter again, back and forth, and feel free to engage on this. Stephen Georgi notes 25.3 makes no sense for our rural communities who have found it impossible to deliver distance educational content when 80% of our students rely on cellular connections for services. There are few, if any, wireless providers due to our heavily forested terrains and our granite bedrock geology. 25.3 is not acceptable. Okay, again, I know it's coming back. I know we've kind of punched holes in the 25.3, but just there's a practical concern. We've just heard that doesn't work. Christina, do you agree or disagree with that response? And what is your answer to someone like that who makes this point that it isn't working?
Absolutely. I think all ISPs should be at the table to solve for his area. I don't know where he lives. He says he has hard rock and heavy forest. I don't think fiber is the answer there either. But hopefully we can make sure we solve for X. But arbitrarily moving the speed standard to 100 by 100 doesn't mean your heavily forested and hard rock area is going to get service. And that's the challenge. I think I agree with Jonathan that focusing on the speeds is we're missing the issue. Is how do we get that community? And I don't know, was it Steve? Steve, I don't know where you live. But what are the challenges that your community faces, and will only one technology solve them? Perhaps this is the Elon Musk question. Maybe his satellite scheme is going to solve their problems forever. But if we keep satellite away from competing, then we'll never know the answer. We'll have to hope and pray that fiber providers somehow get through your heavily forested and rock bed to deliver you service. All I'm arguing is that let's allow competition at the table to serve you. If 25.3 limits that competition, or raising the standard from 25.3 arbitrarily limits competition, meaning moving to a symmetrical standard of 100 by 100 to even compete for a subsidy, then now let's hope fiber can get to you, Steve, because no one else can even compete to serve you.
So I'd have one quick response to Steve. Anywhere in northern Minnesota, northeastern Minnesota, or anywhere else, anywhere somebody was able to get an electric line, you can get a fiber cable. It's less expensive to build fiber than it is to build electric lines. We can do the same thing. The country managed to get electric lines throughout rural America beginning in the 1930s. If we set as a national goal, again, I do. We build fiber. I invest in fiber. But I'm not saying it has to be the exclusive solution. It's just the best solution.
Well, we are running out of time. We have just a few minutes. Let's go ahead and hear from Tyler and Jonathan and Christina. Any final remarks you'd have? What advice would you give as the FCC considers? Hopefully now we've seen a lot more nuance to this question, but as they consider how the standard for the purpose of funding may need to be adapted. Tyler, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll keep it really simple. Again, I just want to jump in and say thank you to Christina and Jonathan. This was really, really helpful context. It's great. As someone who researches a lot of this at the high level, looking at national data, it's always so informative and edifying to jump in with people who are doing work on the ground and actually implementing the networks that we spend all day talking about. So thank you very much. Thank you to the chat. I've been watching, listening. It's great, great discourse. So happy to be here. And Drew, thank you again for having.
Thanks. Again, I appreciate the invitation. Always good to see you, Drew. And I guess in sum, it's not just the FCC. Congress just appropriated, states can use the $10+ billion that Congress has just appropriated for broadband. I would base the decisions. If you're a state broadband, in a state broadband office, governor's office, anyone making these decisions, base them as closely as you can on local community input. Let local communities decide what should be provided in their area. Local communities can have different expressions as to, what constitutes a local community. An electric cooperative is one such expression. Electric cooperatives, which are owned by the members, whose service is provided to the members, that's an expression of local community. But there are others, municipalities and others. Let the communities decide what their levels of service should be, what they would like invested in, how they would like that to be deployed. Don't have the decisions all be made by what comes down to 3 people in northeastern Washington, D.C., or sometimes just one person. Have the decisions made as close to the ground, as close to local communities as you can. My ultimate, goal would be to have those decisions made by each consumer, because I would like to make the decision in my own household, regardless of what the person who lives next to me, how they make their decision.
Thank you. Christina.
Yeah, I just, thank you. This was actually fun. I'm happy to do this anytime. I think FCC should be smart. I think government should be smart. I think that choosing one solution, one size fits all for all of America is not smart. I think that Jonathan has a lot of good points about making local solutions based on local needs. Absolutely. I think that if you are going to change or, redefine the speed standard, you have to make sure you're empowering other technologies to compete. That picking fiber only, if you do 100 by 100, then you need to empower fixed wireless to compete. Then open up more spectrum. We need more mid-band, millimeter wave. We need access to infrastructure. We can 100% compete, but you can't give away handouts to one technology and then say, oh, well, other technologies, you just can't compete because you're not good enough. Well, if you gave other technologies the tools to compete, maybe they will be good enough. So I leave that with our policymakers and friends.
Well, thank you again for everyone for being here. And let me just, change. Before I thank our panelists for being with us, I want to remind everyone that next week we'll be talking about the state of online education 1 year into the pandemic, and the week after we'll be hearing from state broadband officials. Please come back every Wednesday at 12 noon Eastern time. And if you found this valuable, please share this and let others know about it. All of our events are available at broadbandbreakfast.com/BBLO for Broadband Breakfast Live Online. On behalf of Christina Mason, Vice President of WISPA, Tyler Cooper, Editor-in-Chief of Broadband Now, and Jonathan Chambers, partner at Connexxon, I'm Drew Clark. Broadband Breakfast. We'll see you next Wednesday at 12 noon Eastern time. Take care.